All right. Good morning, everyone. Sorry we're a couple of minutes late. Technical issues never seem to be a problem when you're doing the practice sessions today. But here we are. Welcome to this webinar where we're looking at how do we ensure a resilient water network and what does that mean in terms of upgrading existing assets, looking at new infrastructure, etc. How does all that knit together? So we're really looking forward to that. I'm going to do an intro with a few slides with a few thoughts that frame the agenda, and then we'll bring in our speakers, who are from Thames Water and from Southern Water. So, and just to give you a heads up, a couple of heads up, I'm supporting the Waterfront with a conference on water infrastructure, which they're doing on the 19th of November. It happens to be right in the middle of our own Networks November session, so I'm looking forward to that very much. And in terms of questions, yes, there's a chat function, but can we ask that any questions are posed and put into the Q&A, please? Because then they come up in a right way, a better way, and it allows us to bring the questions forward and ask the speakers for comments. So, resilience seems to be quite high on the agenda at the moment. I was at I subsequently listened to a Prestige lecture at the Mechanicals that looked at resilience and asked the question about the application of systems thinking and what difference does that make, and that was last week. So it's really an important subject. We know the climate's changing rapidly, probably more rapidly than we thought. We've going through droughts and floods and lots of other things happening, heavy bouts of rain. So it's a big challenge. So how do we manage that challenge when we're delivering services in terms of water supply, sewage systems, etc.? As an organization, we are there looking at how we bring everyone together, how we focus on innovation, education. That's a core part of what we do. One of the areas we've tentatively looked at is we did a skill style report card looking at all things to do with the sewers side of what happens in the water sector. We looked at everything from asset health, people, sewer maintenance, etc. We did look at leakage because mains are a huge part of asset health and management. And we looked at innovation research and said if we graded this A to F, where would we be? So you see from that top diagram, there's lots of C's and D's and E's. And the purpose of doing this was not to be overly critical. It was to say, where are we? What's the honest conversation? If we open this up and actually look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, what does that mean against those parameters? And so we said things like, have we got a real grasp of asset health? Do we have the right amount of data? Do we need the systems thinking approach, etc.? And then we ran into the same discussion areas in terms of people. Are we doing enough to get new people into the sector from lots of different backgrounds? And are we really driving innovation? And I'll touch on why that's such an important question in just a minute. And so what we're doing, we're trying to bring a whole series of groups together, um, in order to say, are we applying things in a consistent way? If you look at standards, are we really doing smart metering? Are we getting the most from all the things we can do in terms of data, etc. And you may think, oh, what's Reputation doing there? We've been working with an organisation to bring together actually what people think in terms of our sector and what they think the priorities should be. And keep your fingers crossed because of all things going well, there'll be a report emerging in the next few weeks in that space. And innovation, do we really look at innovation in the right way? So we've translated a chunk of this back into a risk register. We've not completed that yet, but just I think it's important to start to look at all these things from a risk register viewpoint. And can we bring all the risks together and then look at what we do in terms of controls, mitigation? I think that's really important. And certainly in terms of resilience, it's hugely important. So why does all this matter? We're in a world now of zettabytes, and one zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes. This is and that goes way over my head, but this is a huge volume of data. And globally, we're at 120 zettabytes, but we're we're going to get to 125 by next year. So it's a phenomenal amount of information. Now, it's so important in terms of what we're talking about today in the water sector, because look at the look at the challenge, the obvious challenge. Healthcare is at the top, whether you look globally, whether you look at the UK. Water's down at 4 or 5%. You know, it's right at the bottom. So it raises the question: are we actually collecting all the data we can collect? Question: are we actually collecting enough data? Another question. And on my own personal view, I think the latter question is the most important one, because we don't have a full sight of all of our assets and what that means. And over the last sort of few years, again, you'll see that we've remained stable as a sector at 4%. We're collecting a lot more information, 20 million gigs more, but we're still stable in relation to healthcare, energy, telecoms. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide at all, but there's a whole reason for why we got gaps and inconsistencies, and the challenges that brings. There is a way forward, try to bring it all into a more unified system, to look at bringing governance systems in, predictive, pulling it all together. Oh, I think that's jumped. Okay. And the reality of all of this is, if we start doing more in terms of data, we do more in terms of not just our understanding, and what that means in terms of resilience. We start developing a lot more interesting thinking around R&D, around all things linked to, I will say, innovation, but in terms of patents, trademarks, it brings all of that together. And until we have all of that understanding and resilience and the systems approach, we do have to consistently ask this question: are we resilient, and what does that mean? Existing and new infrastructure. So I'm now going to invite Tom Carpen, who's from Thames Water, I think the consent strategy lead, Tom. So I will stop sharing, and your slide will come up. So make sure you fire the questions into the Q&A, please, because I think this is where we're going to get to the meat of what we're discussing going forward. So Tom, if your slides work, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Carpen, as Paul says, Consent Strategy Lead for Thames Water for our strategic resource options. So those are all the sort of major new water infrastructure projects in our portfolio, and I'll come on to that a little bit more. But one of them is the proposed reservoir in Oxfordshire that some of you might know about, and a really sort of lame picture of it, I'm afraid. I couldn't get the nice renders onto my slides to send through, but I'll come on to that project in particular in a moment. But yeah, my role and focus is planning for new projects. But before I sort of go on to that, I just want to sort of take up the baton of Paul's resilience challenge and recognise, I think, that new water projects are only one part of a suite of measures that we're trying as water companies to get right, including tackling sort of the leak side of things, and helping people, encouraging people to reduce their water demand. So for me, I think the answer to sort of the challenge is very much around the water resource management plans, which you might be familiar with, and certainly ours is significantly focused on those other areas of resilience. But planning is a significant part of this as well. The new projects are as well, and water companies are using the planning process for national infrastructure projects in particular, pretty much for the first time for new water resources. We've had a couple of wastewater projects go through that process. So this is quite a big time, I think, for the water sector in terms of bringing new projects forward. So I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that we're all asking ourselves, how do we do it all? Ensure the resilience, innovate with our existing assets, and build new ones to address that sort of triple challenge, I think, of growth, both in people, number of people and places, and in terms of enhancing our natural environment and adapting to climate change as well. When I joined Thames about 10 months ago and new to the water sector, I've got a background in in planning, both in public sector as in policy and in projects, and in the private sector as well as a consultant. But I'm mostly focused on energy and transport. So it's been really interesting to see, and picking up on Paul's point earlier as well, how do we as a sector pull together our data, our understanding of the water system, and how do we integrate that with place and people? And that's what the planning system is designed to do. And this is where the water resource management plans are so important. A really good one does integrate all those three elements of existing assets, managing demand, and new water resource. But it's really clear for me this isn't an either or. We've got to do all of them, and that's I think backed up by the National Infrastructure Commission, certainly from their 2018 report on preparing a drive for a drier future, and also the national policy statements, which are planning documents for making decisions on new water resource projects. They both say the same thing, that it's not either or, it's and. But I think, so on my side, I've got sort of three bullets there. And the first of those is, the question is the planning process a barrier or an enabler? Because there are people who object to our projects and really want us to either build them elsewhere, not build them at all, or build them differently. And I think what the planning process does, and particularly the development consent order process, allows them the opportunity to make their case to the planning inspectorate as an impartial organisation with examining inspectors, and ultimately the Secretary of State to make a decision. But on the flip side, I think over my career, I've lost track of how many people feel and consider the planning process to be a barrier and hold things up. Generally not welcoming, not welcome for delaying projects and our ability to get on and do things that we, in common sense terms, might feel right, or if we feel really strongly about our projects, which I know we do in Thames, and we can see the need and the consequences of not building them, then the frustration of going through quite a rigorous process, you can understand that side of it as well. So I'm interested, for people on the call, kind of, which bit resonates with you? Do you see it as a barrier or an enabler? Particularly given the upfront work that the water sector does with the regulators and DEFRA on the water resource management plans. I think my view is very much that, particularly the DCO process, it's really important. It's an enabler. It creates the legitimacy for projects to be delivered on the ground and for people to have had the opportunity to actually shape them. There's a lot of upfront work that goes in with engaging communities and statutory consultees to really understand what the potential impacts of a project might be, how you really design the powers you seek to mitigate impacts and make sure that you deliver it in a way that is, controlled in the right way, and actually you get the outcomes you want at the end. So I'm very much in the sort of enabling side of things. But I do think, and going on to my sort of second point, planning for water still feels, to me, coming in relatively new, very sort of regulatory and water systems driven. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the place element is really important for me, from my point of view. How can we unlock local authorities and regions and all the expertise working together and people and their knowledge of where they live to really unlock the potential of new water assets? Is it probably easier for something like a reservoir than it is river abstraction projects and water transfer schemes? But I think our reservoirs quite a good example where there's very public opposition and very public support for it as well, and it makes it a very interesting sort of space to be in, where those tensions play out. And I think there's an opportunity at the moment to look at how we do that strategically. And you might be aware that government's currently consulting on its national planning policy framework, which sets the sort of national policy for particularly for town and country planning matters, but also relates to the DCO process, development consent order process for national infrastructure projects. And for me, it's an opportunity for government to recognise the need and the opportunity to bring local authorities, water companies, regulators together, particularly through the local plan process, but not only that, to help water projects be integrated into place, particularly to support government's missions on growth and on energy, because I think without water, neither of these missions can really succeed, in my view. So my final reflection, I think, is point 3, and this is something I sort of reflected on my career across energy transport in planning for 20 odd years, that energy definitely seems to be the focal point, and that's not to take away from the need for that. But water doesn't seem to have that clout, doesn't seem to have that profile. It doesn't seem to have, if you like, the policy and political sort of levers that energy has had. And I wonder how much of that our industry and sector can relate to, and what else we can do to support sort of stronger, particularly in the planning sphere, support for these kind of projects. I think you can see from the energy sector in particular, previous government and current government looking at strategic spatial energy plan, designating projects as critical national priority for national infrastructure projects, which means I think, you know, the strategic challenges are tackled at source. And then when it comes to the decision, there's a strong sort of balance in favour provided, and I think it's a really strong caveat that aspects of the process for bringing people on board and tackling the problems are done properly, fairly, transparently. I think in the water sector, the water resource management plans go a long way to doing the strategic challenges, but again, for me, they focus more in the regulatory water system space, but we don't have that critical national priority designation. So I think there's probably a moment in time in the next few months where we can look strategically at new water resources as part of that bigger picture of what water resources management plans cover, which I think will then help us deliver the long-term resilience that we do need from the water sector as a whole. And I'll leave it there, Paul. I hope that's okay place to stop.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. It'll be interesting to explore a little bit more when we get to Q&A, your question around planning. There is the whole resilience issue. Do the water resource management plans tackle that? Do we miss a trick by not including all the drainage? And another drainage and wastewater management plans now emerging and coming into that into that regulatory space. But you pose a question around planning, and I think when we get to Q&A, I'll come back to that, because I'd like to ask how many people is planning totally understood in the context of project delivery across the sector. But I'll leave that as a question mark. But thank you very much, Tom. Sophie, delighted to welcome Sophie Flacks, who's the infrastructure solicitor at Southern Water. And Sophie, I won't get you to dwell on the last question, but I think there's an event I attended last year. There's a lot of understanding and equally misunderstanding all around how it all fits together within the planning context and framework. I'm not saying it was an eye opener, but it's interesting, and when you get lots of different views in the room, it sort of opens your eyes a lot to how people are thinking, or perceptions. But I don't want to tread on your toes, so over to you, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Paul. And yes, I think that's a really interesting point to lead me in on, because, of course, Tom has very expertly run us through the major kind of challenges and opportunities for delivery of these huge schemes through development consent orders. But of course, fundamentally new to the industry, the water industry, to deliver consents through that regime. And at water company levels as well. So an interesting time. And yeah, absolutely agree, Paul. Probably not as much understanding as we would like about how that will work through the planning regime. Somebody's got my my slides to bring up for me. Thank you. So I'm Sophie Flacks. I'm an infrastructure solicitor at Southern Water, and I've been in-house for about 7 years, working on delivery of major projects and working on the supply side. So my experience really is on the regulatory and consenting aspects of supply schemes for water companies, and it's been an interesting time. So I thought I would, and I'd just like to say thanks to Tom as well, because I've been scribbling things down, which I always think is a very good sign of being on an interesting panel. So yes, I've got a few things that I've taken away already from Tom, but it is really a joint learning session. So if you've got any questions or suggestions, please do pop them in the chat. My role is around delivery of big schemes that Southern's involved in. So they are predominantly the schemes that are passing through what's called the rapid gated process. And I'll go on to that a little bit later. So there's a scheme in Hampshire that we're working on, which is the Hampshire Water Transfer and Water Recycling Project, which is about interacting with a consented reservoir, Heaven Thicket Reservoir, to enhance productivity from that reservoir into our supply network using water recycling. And then working jointly with Thames and others on Cesro, which is the new reservoir in Abingdon, which is again early stage of the development consent order process, and Thames to Southern Transfer, which is the major new pipeline link that will bring water from that reservoir down into our supply area. I thought I'd start off with, if we go to the next slide, please. So thinking about what the demands are on our water network, I think was the challenge that was posed. And of course, we as water companies have a statutory obligation to plan for the next 25 years ahead on 5-yearly cycles to produce what are called water resource management plans, WRMPs. And so in that context, we look at things like climate change, population growth, and there's a huge environmental destination agenda at the moment, which is quite right, which has come from government, which is all about leaving more water in the environment effectively for protection of species and habitats. So it's looking at how we can meet our supply demand balance and working out how much water we need and how we're going to plug that gap, so to speak, for the next 25-year period. And so the plans set that strategic direction. Thames Water has recently secured its approval from the Secretary of State to publish its final Water Resource Management Plan 2024. Lots of water companies are still awaiting permission to publish, and we're actually out to reconsult very soon on our own plan at Southern. And all of that's in the context of regional water resource management planning for the first time, which is a fantastic thing, because what it means is water companies aren't preparing their plans in isolation. They're working with other water companies in the region to work out what the need is at a regional level. And so, like jigsaw puzzle pieces, the water company plans should fit in to that regional plan. With the strategic aim really of creating a grid where water can be moved around the country, a bit like the national grid for electricity. So there is a huge need looking forward. I think the latest I saw where government had sort of totted up how much all the water resource management plans had calculated would be needed was that by 2050 we would need an additional 5 billion litres a day. So the challenge is there, and the need is there for new infrastructure effectively to plug that gap. But of course, that's not the only way that we plug that gap. And Tom has mentioned, of course, the need to look at the water use and, of course, leakage, which Paul also touched on. So the new infrastructure is just one part of that solution. And so it's looking at new ways that we can secure supply. And it's also looking at ways, because of climate change and because of the need to leave more water in the environment for species and habitats, it's looking at ways we can move away from reliance on groundwater and river water sources to deliver rainfall independent sources effectively. And that's all in the context of the cost of living crisis, the public perception challenge that water companies have got, and a need to really drive as low a customer bill position as we can. But of course, I think there's acknowledgement across the industry that bills have been low in the water sector, and that they will need to rise. So water companies have recently submitted their responses to Ofwat's draft determinations of the business plans for the next planning period. And that's really all about finding the right balance between keeping the bills low as possible, but then the investment that's needed to deliver the sustainable future sources that we need, as well as, of course, maintenance and planned upgrades that are already, required for our network. And I thought it might be useful to give just a little bit of give an example, basically a little bit of context around that from the Southern Water perspective. So that interaction between investment needed and impact on customer bills, and why it's coming to a head now. So the Southern Water bill has historically been one of the cheapest in the country, actually, for the last 20 years or so, and hasn't risen in line with inflation. And we have been relying heavily, really, on access to cheap water. So the Chalk Aquifer that the Southern Water area sits on creates effectively plentiful, high quality and local water that doesn't need to be transported, doesn't need a huge amount of treatment, and is cheap as a result. But we've been relying on these groundwater and river water sources, and we need to move away from that because of sustainability challenges for that. So looking at delivery of new schemes is going to, of course, move us away from that dependence, and will of course cost money to make that investment, but it's the right thing to do. And it's all part of our business plan. And of course, there's that interaction between water resource management planning, where we need the schemes, where we need to invest, and then feeding that through to the business plans. Could I have the next slide, please? So how do we build a resilient network? So of course, we need to look at saving water, reducing demand and per capita consumption, installing smart meters, engaging with customers, helping customers save water in their homes and businesses, fixing leaking pipes, toilets, taps, all of that good stuff, and working hard on our own infrastructure to fix leaks, to use the best emerging technology to stem the loss of water through our own pipe network. And again, that's, I was scribbling down what Paul was saying, around the data that we need for where those leaks are, and how we efficiently, and I think probably that's the first time I've used the word efficient, but this is all about efficiency. How do we efficiently, kind of stem those flows, and create as low a baseline of what we need as possible. And then, of course, we need to look at investment, and moving away from that dependence on rainfall dependent sources such as aquifers and rivers. Looking forward, reservoirs, water transfers will continue to play a significant role for us, but also looking at desalination and water recycling. So across all of the water companies, you'll see as part of the mix, we've got a lot more desalination and water recycling becoming more prevalent. And of course, imports. Less reliance on drought permits and drought orders from existing sources. So where we're kind of seeking to extend what we're able to under permits and licenses. And a lot of those permits and licenses are not going to be there in future. So becoming more sustainable through investment in new infrastructure. We've got the context of the regional WRMPs, which is really helpful, as I've said, and a really positive starting place for our company plans. And then we've got RAPID, which is the new regulator, effectively a partnership between Ofwat, the Environment Agency, and the DWI, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, which was created at PR19 to accelerate the development of new water resource schemes by water companies. So RAPID has created this gated process to help accelerate the schemes that have been identified, to test them against alternatives and to strengthen the proposals, really, to fund them through multi asset management plan periods so that they can get to delivery. And then it's looking at the new procurement model of direct procurement for customers and how that works at a company level, and truly interrogating and understanding that, and looking at SIPA, which seems to be the route that Thames is going down, and indeed was how Thames Tideway was delivered, I believe. And then some of those challenges around bulk supplies, where you've got these huge, significant schemes that are able to serve more than one supply area. How do you calculate who's entitled to what, who pays for what, and what could be fair and reasonable in that context? So can I have the next slide, which is my final slide? Thank you. So this is just looking at what the challenges are. So mentioned the funding challenges, and there's this perennial gap, really, I think it's fair to say at the moment, which is, something that needs to be really resolved at a regulator level, I think. And this is a bit of a challenge, really, I suppose. It emerged from the House of Lords Committee into the work of Ofwat. Really interesting series of committees that were held, looking at how Ofwat works and how other regulators fit into that. And this gap was identified, and it's something we do feel at a water company level, between what is needed in the eyes of the Environment Agency and for the environment, and then what Ofwat is willing to enable us to fund through customer bills. So how do we manage that? How do we plug the gap where necessary with alternative investment, and how do we make that investment attractive to investors? So getting a fully funded business plan is fundamental, which bridges the gap between customer expectations, regulatory requirements, minimises the impact on the environment, to deliver all of those things that need investment. And if you're an investor, how do we ensure that there's a fair return? So yes, so it's about confidence for the next asset management period, AMP8 and beyond that. It's about looking at those challenges which are coming forward from having these, I suppose, novel in the UK solutions, water resource solutions of desalination, water recycling, etc., public perception around that. So particularly in the case of water recycling, public perception for the kind of acceptability of that technology. And then in the context of desalination, the environmental challenges of the highly saline brine that they produce and the necessary coastal locations for that, which are coastal locations being highly protected, generally speaking, certainly along our coastline in the southeast. And then those commercial arrangements between water companies. How do we make that work for the companies that are both the producer and the recipient? What happens in a drought where you've got, let's say, a source in one neighbouring water company's area, and the supply is meant to be reaching the recipient water company, where you've got statutory obligations to supply customers? And then delivery of consent by development consent order. It's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge, because it's new for the industry, it's new for the water companies. So it is the preferred consenting route for most of those schemes, if not all of the schemes passing through the rapid gated process, because it's well suited to delivery of major infrastructure, as Tom's set out. but how do we get the water companies to fully understand and be able to drive that to get us to a position that the energy industry is in now? So, we've got 10, 15 years to get to where they are with some of this stuff. But we need the scheme sooner than that. So it's using that to its best effect, really, and being able to direct that. So I suppose from my perspective, we've got all those challenges. We're grappling with them as a water company on a daily basis in the major projects team, and trying to find a pathway through. It's not straightforward, but there's a lot of very committed individuals trying to get the schemes over the line. So a lot of hard work, a lot of elbow grease, and yeah, talking as well, talking to others in the industry and trying to learn together. So yeah, I think that's my final slide.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Sophie. And I just a couple of things you touched on. I've got a I was watching an event last week, and they reflected on the past 20 years, and they looked particularly at London. But the past 20 years, significant events have occurred every year linked to flooding, heat wave, droughts, snow and ice, warm springs and warm autumns, heat waves, etc. Droughts, obviously, and then the last few years we've had the record heat. I think a couple of years ago for a long period of time, the warmest year on record in 2023, and it was a warm, wet winter leading into 2024. And these are significant events that have major impacts on infrastructure, which needs to be taken account of as well. And I think that all needs to be reflected in the challenges. And therefore, I think as you've alluded to when you're talking about how Rapid is moving projects forward, and if anyone doesn't know, Rapid brings the EA, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and Ofwat together to, as Sophie said, to try to fast track water resource problems. It creates a challenge where we're getting locked up in lots of discussions. Doesn't necessarily help us, and I think you alluded to the fact we need to move things quicker. The idea of a national grid is something that sits in my head quite a bit, because we do have soft water areas, hard water areas, and it's not as straightforward as shifting water between them. But we do need to think differently in this space as to where resources are, and actually some of the existing contracts as well, I would argue, where there's agreements to supply certain volumes of water already in play between a number of the water companies in the southeast. So the question then for both of you, and I touched on it, Tom, when I reflected on a couple of things you said. So there's the planning process, and there's do we have a planning process fully integrated into our sector? And so if you think you touched on the way energy and others do things differently. So that would probably be my first question. But linked to that is, do we have enough understanding of what that whole process means, not just in a water resource management context, but in a context where we need to be resilient everywhere. And at some stage we are going to need to look at the fact that we can treat wastewater to potable standards, but I know it's politically unacceptable at the moment in some ways, but all of that needs to come into the mix. And it often strikes me that the level of understanding that you've both brought into the webinar this morning, I don't necessarily see that when I go to other parts of operations and business, when I have the regular discussions, not just with the water utilities, but more broadly than that with the EA and others. So Tom, as you sort of touched on it earlier, I'll ask you first.
Thank you, Paul. No, I mean, I think it's a challenge for the planning profession in many respects. I think people who aren't sort of using the planning process day to day, it can appear sort of complex and daunting in some respects, and particularly when you come to a nationally significant infrastructure project. And I think there's a lot of work that's gone in over the last sort of 15 years in its operation to help people understand what it's trying to do, but ultimately I think it does remain sort of distant from communities and people who aren't using it every day. And then I think for the water sector, because we haven't had to use this process, it is very new. And I know sort of from sort of trying to join the sector, kind of trying to get traction on consensus is a thing, DCO is a thing. Let's engage with it. It's 10 months in, as I say, and still having some of those conversations around in places. But I think more significantly for me, it doesn't need to be complicated. Ultimately, we are. There are some very sort of straightforward concepts in this about talking to people and understanding kind of both the immediate local impact of something, but also the bigger picture of what the water coming out of the taps and what's the impact of drought, and start to bring those kind of sort of very sort of interesting discussions in some respects, but sort of tackling what people might be anxious about, just to an everyday conversation rather than a technical conversation, and building on that. And I think for the reservoir in particular, we're looking at the legacy and how it can be used longer term, and what does that mean for people in their local area. And people are obviously interested and care about whether there are houses and whether there's jobs. And I don't think we engage in that kind of way. I think rather than talk about the planning process itself, it's about what the process is trying to achieve. So I think that might be for the water sector, trying to sort of bridge our gap between what we do heads down and what we're doing when we're talking to people in the communities, which is where I think the DCO process does help. It forces you to get out there and talk to people, forces you to hold those engagement sessions early. And we do a lot of it, and I've learned so much from just standing around a model or a display screen, just talking to people about what it means for them.
Yeah. Sophie, what do you think?
Yes, I may agree and agree with Tom and recognise what he says. And Tom's got a huge amount of experience on development consent order stuff, and he's actually a really good example of what we're trying to do in the water industry, which is attract individuals in to help us deliver these schemes with knowledge from other sectors. Right, so this is exactly, Tom's like a shining beacon of exactly what we're trying to do. He's come into Thames and he's leading, with that knowledge gained over a long period of time to upskill internally. I think as an industry, we do rely heavily on consultants and consultancies. We're entering into a new asset management planning period. A lot of those consultants we've been working with for the last 5 years are now upping sticks and going off, and we're going to have to now work to ramp up internally to get new people on board, and then in another 5 years, who knows whether they'll still be there to support us. And of course there's churn within those consultancies, so and it makes perfect sense. Of course, you've got individuals who gain knowledge in the consultancies, but then off they go to pastures new. So it's all about, for us at Southern, trying to get people in to work for us who can lead this really new to us pathway with that experience they've gained elsewhere. Because I think you're absolutely right, Paul. I completely recognise what you're saying, which is there isn't enough understanding of how delivery by development consent, how the planning regime works to support these big schemes within the water companies. So yeah, I suppose my perspective is, yes, we need sort of the governance around that internally, so that we're unlocking the decisions at the senior levels as and when we need them to expedite these schemes. Yes, we have fantastic consultants working for us to help us deliver these schemes, but really it's about getting people in working for the water companies, as members of staff, and building that knowledge internally, so that can really, that information knowledge can really flow up, in a sort of effective and reliable long-term way. Internal resilience, I suppose.
That raises a very different question, doesn't it? When we talk about resilience, we tend to think of the infrastructure more so than the actual knowledge and the people and the broader understanding. And something I was thinking of as you were both presenting in the midst of all this, and the midst of all the thinking, and the water resource management plans, as an example, all being, sort of developed in relation to the coming AMP period, but they do stretch over 20, 25 years. All this happened, and then we have an election. Then a new government comes in and says, "Oh, right, come on, let's go and build 1.5 to 2 million houses." And suddenly, with all the work you're doing, all the current schemes, does that suddenly throw something up in the air that says, "Oh, actually, this could equal a lot more resource requirement"? And then we have to, I think you both said, you have to balance that between what does environment need, what do people need, what does industry need.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a really good point. I might just come in on that if you don't mind, Tom. So I think that's absolutely true, and there is a risk there. But as part of the WRMP process, where there are material changes that happen within that 5-year period, we would need to redo the modelling effectively. So what if there was a big change, such as this example you gave, there would be that opportunity to look again at the modelling and to revise, the need and the projections for population growth in the area, etc. It's the population growth calculations are all based on local authority figures that come through local plans effectively. So yes, there is that opportunity to readjust things. But I think the one really positive thing about working in this space, and there are lots of positive things about working in this space, but one of the really positive things is, and I remember when our consents lead, Ian Frost, came on and joined us at Southern, I said, "Tim, you're not going to struggle with need, because there's only one direction this is going in. And the direction is we need more resilience, we need more water." So I think he'd come from the airport industry previously, where it was, they'd been hit by COVID and things like that. Was there really going to be so much international travel? So the need is there. And as you say, I don't think they're going to come in and say we need 200,000 less homes. So I think we all recognise that the growth is needed and it needs to be supported. So it's how can the water industry really be fit for purpose to assist with that.
Yeah, and so Tom, taking that last point that Sophie's made, is what do you feel about the resilience side? Because it's not just the infrastructure, is it? But it's the people, it's the understanding, it's that broader engagement that brings in all the. And you're talking about transfer schemes that aren't just from one authority to another. There'll be lots of local authorities in the midst of all of that, and things need to move at some sort of pace to keep up with things that are happening.
Yeah, they do. Well, and sorry, I just want to say, Sophie, thank you. You've been really kind about me, and I think, picking up on your point there, Paul, Sophie, equally your understanding and expertise of how this all fits together, particularly the regulatory and the bulk transfer and the commercial side of things, I think speaks to your point there, Paul. And one sort of just drawing on sort of my previous experience in government as civil service doing the policy side of things, that stability I think is really important, because it creates that longer term knowledge. Again, Sophie, your point about need is absolutely right, and I think what you get is a government with political impetus plus a significant amount of expertise across the department. And I think what we see in the national infrastructure space over the last 4 years has been a real effort to try and rewire government around infrastructure delivery, so it's not different departments but actually the centre and the departments working together with the agencies. Huge amount of effort and learning has gone into that, and I think what the water sector can do is continue that engagement, but encourage not just the usual people sort of doing the talking, but actually other organisations. And I'm on the board of the National Infrastructure Planning Association, and trying to get water to be part of that conversation is, I think, just as important. But so is the local authority input, and so are other, third parties to projects as well. I think shaping that policy understanding and that engagement is a critical part to make it happen at speed, because I think if you can do that and you've got the need case there and you've worked through some of those really difficult issues about where and why, because we get people saying, why have a strategic reservoir for the southeast in Oxfordshire when it's all going to go to London? And water is obviously conserved locally as well, and they're real tensions for people and understandable ones. So if you're transferring water from one part of the country to another, and in the way that kind of Sophie's outlined, actually all the interdependencies that are there, if you're thinking of it like a grid, then actually you change one scheme and take a reservoir out or shrink it, actually that creates all the knock-on effects. So I do think in that kind of strategic and again very sort of more straightforward space about water need, to build the resilience, I think we've got to build the engagement, and we've got to build the engagement in very many different ways so that people feel the water sort of system is there for them, and the work we're doing, we're carrying out with trust and credibility as well.
Yeah, trust and credibility. Yeah. So question, I'm conscious where we're sitting with time. You both raised some really interesting things. If there's a top three of things that need to be in place in relation to resilience from your perspective, what would that top three look like? And I know that's a really challenging question, and I know both of you have thrown up lots of different things about how we need more knowledge, people, etc., as well. But what would your first thoughts be?
I can throw in one for starters, I think, and again, I think there's something in there around agencies like the Environment Agency, government departments, and the planning sort of functions, if you like, and water companies around the table, actually kind of at the strategic level, really kind of saying, we know what we need to hit for the regulator targets. Are we going to get there? And then thinking about the system and saying, right, out of that, what resource effort needs to go where? Do we need to give more capacity to the Environment Agency to support the projects and tackle some of the really knotty technical issues that you get with these schemes? So that'll be I'll start with that one and then maybe hand it back to Sophie.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one, and I think a lot of conversations are possibly happening within the regulator space, amongst the regulators, perhaps through RAPID or other forums, and then happening between the water companies, trying to feed into that, but actually getting everybody around the table in a collaborative way would be really, really helpful. I think there is a challenge about us now moving into AMP8 and working through that upskilling kind of proposal. So both within the water company, but then also getting our new set of consultants on board and helping us to deliver. And I think finally it's about events actually like this. The more we can actually get together and share knowledge, and I think there's only sort of a couple that came up last year where I thought, yes, we're talking about exactly what we need to be talking about, and I must join it. So the more I see about water resource infrastructure, about getting around the table and talking about these things, the better, frankly, because I think between us we've got all sorts of different perspectives, and we can help each other. So yeah.
I would agree with that, and I think you touched on it earlier, Sophie, about the churn and the understanding and the knowledge. I think chunks of this are to do with knowledge, and you don't want to be re-understanding things because there's been a change of people or change of personnel. So the more we can do to sort of hold that knowledge and ideally keep people within this space as much as keeping hold of the information, I think is important, because we do get dominated by infrastructure. And yes, infrastructure is really key, but understanding all the different bits in terms of planning and where it fits in as well, direct consents. I mean, a few years ago, direct procurement was the big thing on major projects, and that seems to have, well, we're not quite sure where it's gone in water, but it hasn't moved it anywhere near the pace that it should do. So then the final question to you both on this space is, we've got AMP8 coming up. Sophie, you've highlighted it. There's going to be a real challenge in, big spend, but we have to deliver. We have to have the capacity to deliver. So that's going to be a challenge. The water resource management plans aim to and attempt to look at 20-25 years, but we get pulled into the 5-year thing every time, and it's not it's the reality of the regulation. So how can we keep what we know and what you both highlighted actually needs to be the longer perspective? So there's the rapid schemes, great, but they alone aren't going to be enough for us all moving forward. So how do we keep within the 5-year drive that broader 20-year sort of horizon that we need to look at?
Shall I have a first stab at that one, Tom?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think it's really good that there is this kind of emerging recognition, I suppose, that we need to be looking beyond the 5-year AMP cycles. So we saw that at PR19 with the establishment of Rapid, and then and there may be examples in other water companies, but certainly between Southern and Portsmouth Water, we had a particular final determination for Havant Thicket Reservoir, which crossed over 2 AMP periods. So, that broader view. For me, there's a big piece around delivery teams. This is internally, delivery teams and regulatory teams talking to each other. So you've got the delivery teams got quite a clear picture of this is how much we think we're going to need over the next AMP, but we're going to cross into the next AMP, and this is how much we're going to need in the next AMP. And we may even cross into the AMP after that, and this is how much we think we're probably going to need in that period. And then reflecting that back through into the regulatory space and having that slice through being accurate at that point in time. Of course, we all know that major projects in particular, can move around in terms of dates and cost, but having that internal conversation to ensure that as far as possible we're able to slice up the schemes to fit into that arbitrary regulatory cycle, I think.
Yeah, I'd pick up on that, Sophie. I agree. I think there's a really interesting internal piece for water companies, and what I've really enjoyed actually in Thames is the ability to work with. So we have a dedicated sort of strategic resource option team that look at the whole portfolio of our SROs and then guide the consultant project teams on individual projects. But we kind of work as one team, and I found it fascinating to kind of play a role in working out how does that link to commercial, how does that link to regulatory, and having that kind of really good joint working with those different functions, and then our sponsor from within Thames as well. And you can really sense that interaction, I think, that you're talking about, Sophie, that kind of delivery and regulatory functions we internally sort of looking at the strategic picture, looking at the systems picture. People will be looking 25 years ahead, and we'll be looking at next week's engagement, but they are absolutely linked, particularly with some of the questions that come up from communities. So I think having that internal pulling in the same direction, understanding, is probably quite critical, and it's actually one of the enjoyable parts of the job, I find, as well.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're slightly overrun, so we'll but that's fascinating, and I'm going to make another plug for data. I'm becoming a big fan. The amount of data being collected now is a little bit scary because I can't even understand the numbers, but I do know that there are gaps, and there are too many gaps across what we do in the sector. And the more information we get, so that we know a lot better about our understanding. I mean, there's gaps in volumes of groundwater availability as one example. So the more we can pull in information, it can underpin and support what you both outlined, and we've got a lot of confidence around what we're beginning to say and why we're saying it. I found it absolutely fascinating. So Sophie and Tom, big thanks to both of you, because you've articulated some quite complex things very well. And Sophie, I've got something in the back of my mind now about your challenge of events that you would want to attend. So I've got that now as one of the targets for our organisation, because I do think we don't talk about this in terms of planning and thinking enough. So that's going to become part of our agenda going forward. So thank you both very much. And I believe Waterfront, if there's anything you want to add, please do. Otherwise, thank you everyone for being online. It is being recorded, so this will be available to not just yourselves, but any colleagues that you would like to actually watch this, which I would highly recommend. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Cheers.